Thanks to rising interest rates, things look a little better in terms of pricing of insurance and potentially these premium hikes that people who have long-term care policies have experienced that rising interest rates do make that better for insurers. So if
We're here with Christine Benz from Morningstar, as I stated, one of my favorite people that I've never actually met in person. We just have never been at the same conference or in the same city. And every time I invite her to speak at our conference, she has another conference she's speaking at. So we're going to get that down at some point, Christine.
I hope so, Roger.
I was really excited to talk to you about the state of retirement planning because I think you have a really unique perspective. And obviously the research and articles that you do at Morningstar, but you also get to talk to a lot of people across our profession on the Longview podcast, which is an amazing podcast. So I think you have a different perspective than, say, Roger and his individual trench of working with clients. So what do you think about talking about the state of retirement planning? You open to that?
I would love to. It's such a fascinating area with so many different tentacles. We could, I think, talk all afternoon. So absolutely.
So I divided this up. I figured we'd talk about planning process, investment and products, long-term care insurance, because I know that's one that you've written a lot about and what the state of that is at the moment. And then blind spots that someone who maybe is 3 to 5 years out might want to start thinking about. So from your perspective, how would you describe the state of retirement planning as a process?
Well, I do think it's gotten much more holistic, which I think is a change for the better. Part of that is just an outgrowth of the investment environment that we've found ourselves in over the past couple of decades, where I think, probably in my dad's era, uh, it would have been not so difficult to make do on a portfolio that kicked off income producing securities. Certainly, pensions had a much greater penetration back then. So I think that retirement planning has really evolved for the better over the past couple of decades to be more holistic, to be, from an investment standpoint, more total return oriented, where the idea is just to construct a portfolio that makes sense given your time horizon and then not really obsess over specifically how you extract the cash flow from the portfolio. So I think developments have mainly gone in a positive direction because I think most serious retirement planners are thinking much more holistically than they once did.
Yeah, I know you had Dan Haylett on the Longview podcast, one of my favorite human beings, who is very much on the human side of retirement planning. He and I are actually speaking at a conference next month in March. What I have found interesting is we're leaning into the human side, and you could call it a merging of coaching and the hard numbers of retirement planning, right? But there's very little education. I find myself, I was debating on getting a master's degree. I'm like, well, what would I get a master's degree? Would it be finance? I don't think I need finance. And I'm thinking it might be psychology because so much of what I do ends up being negotiation, might be counseling between spouses or even helping someone negotiate between themselves. So I worry a little bit as we merge it to more humanistic is that we're not really trained in that way.
Yeah, no, and I think a lot of financial advisors kind of pull back for that reason, that they maybe feel that they don't have the training or think that the client's getting that coaching from some other advisor, spiritual advisor, whatever the case might be. They might just not think it's their purview. I think the problem is that a lot of older adults are not getting that feedback from anyone, especially about the importance of, okay, you're ready to retire, your numbers line up, your finances line up, but nobody's talking to them about, well, how are you going to replace that sense of purpose that you might have had from your work when you're retired? What will you do with your time? Literally, like how will you fill your days? And importantly, the relationship piece as well. For males, the research really suggests that that's oftentimes kind of a blind spot as men and women certainly step into retirement, that they had these great relationships with colleagues and they may maintain them through retirement, but but they may not. And they may not have other relationships that can fill that void. And relationships are just such a key component of human happiness and satisfaction.
Yeah, the four pillars that we've identified, and I'm building a master class on it now, is energy, which is that physical aspect, and people like Peter Attia, there's a lot of interest in. I need to build energy, and then passion, like you mentioned, relationships, and mindset. Still having a growth mindset on that relationship piece. A good friend of mine, Dan Miller, who passed away last month, was the master at this. He always had friends downstream. He was in his mid 70s. He was very intentional about building younger friends. And that's something I think, like your my parents probably didn't really do very much.
Yeah, no, it's something that I talked with Laura Karstensen about at the Stanford Center on Longevity. She made that precise point. She's like, there's so much attention paid to diversification across asset classes, diversifying your investment portfolio. Well, we should be diversifying our lives in other ways and across friends of different age bands makes all the sense in the world, which is, one deficiency when you think about some of these communities that are very centered around older adults. It's a drawback unless the older adult has some specific sort of entree into a world where they're rubbing shoulders with people of different ages. It's just not going to happen in their naturally occurring community. So it's definitely something I've been thinking about.
I had a conversation on this, Christine, with a client, and we were talking about this subject because they want to pursue this. And what I said is, it's actually a good dynamic because it's obvious what a younger person might be able to bring to us, fresher ideas, help with technology, all those type of things. But it also, and this sort of like, he had to think about it for a second. I said, well, it also put pressures on you because you have to be interesting enough to want to be a younger person to want to be around. Right?
Very much so. I love that.
Yeah. It's like the old dog, new dog. They both help each other. If you've ever owned dogs, I often refer to my clients as dogs, I guess. Have you read Die with Zero by Bill Perkins?
No, we've wanted to get him on the podcast. I've not yet read the book, but I'm super intrigued by the concept. Have you had him on the podcast?
I have not. I just finished the book. It had been on my list for a while to read. I don't agree with everything he says. He comes from a position of significant wealth. So there's some stylistic things, but one thing I really like, Christine, when it comes to this retirement planning, is the idea of all years aren't created equal. Like I'm sure you've seen this, and in retirement planning, and Dan Crosby and I were talking about this the other day. We are really good from a planning process to help people decumulate, but we're not good at helping them spend money. We actually have a little bit, depending on how the compensation works, a disincentive to have them spend money. And the concept from die early or die with zero, don't die early.
I plan not to.
No, please don't. You're too important. Was that you need to think of all the things that you want to do, and then you need to group them because you may not be able to do them. And I think a lot of people feel that pressure. And I think that's an area in the retirement planning process that we could probably improve a lot on, is helping people get over their frugality. I call it overcoming frugality, especially those that have been blessed to be able to accumulate enough because of hard work and serendipity and everything else.
I love how you talk about this, Roger, in your work. I think it's such an important issue and really a problem for a lot of older adults. I suspect I'm going to have the same problem when I get to the decumulation phase, because as you kind of cruise through your life, and if you've been an assiduous saver, it's really hard to make that transition to spend from your portfolio. I was talking to Jamie Hopkins about this problem, and he said that he likes the idea of, just test it out a little bit. Like buy your next car with cash, see how that feels to take that amount out of your portfolio because you're going to have to get used to it. And I also think that the term spending is itself a little bit off-putting for some people, that I think they think it has to be all about like me, greed. I'm going to, suddenly go out to dinner 7 nights a week or do whatever I consider to be sort of lavish and unnecessary, when in fact it can be much more encompassing, these portfolio withdrawals that you might make. And the whole idea of doing smaller lifetime gifts, for example, I think can be just incredibly energizing for older adults and also impactful. I wrote about a gift that my husband and I had received from my mom and dad when we were just kind of getting our lives off the ground shortly after we got married, and we were putting together a home down payment, and we had a nice sum. We had probably 10% of the home we hoped to buy. And I remember my dad said, well, what if we gave you a little bit extra to buy a better home than some of the things that you're looking at right now? And it made all the difference to us. It was not a huge sum. Certainly it was much, much smaller than the amount that I eventually inherited from my mom and dad, which is not to say I inherited a fortune, but I inherited a nice sum. But it was just at the right point in time, it made such a difference. And I think if people think about gifts like that, whether helping children get launched, or helping grandchildren pay off student loan debt, even knocking out 20,000 of that debt, could be such a tremendous gift. And
Has
so
a
I
much
think
bigger impact than if they receive it like when you were 60. Right.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. So those smaller gifts early in life, and I credit Mike Piper to really opening my eyes to this whole idea. Mike wrote a great little book called More Than Enough about people who are in that luxurious spot of having saved more than they need for their own lifetimes. How seeing their money work in this way to help alleviate people's worries and help them achieve smaller financial goals can be just so incredibly satisfying.
So we have this one crisis. Well, I think you'll enjoy that book, by the way. I enjoyed it
Which one?
much more than
Die with Zero. Yeah,
That Was
I
Zero. I
plan to read it.
actually, for some reason, I didn't really I had it. And I'm like, I don't really feel like reading that. But I enjoyed it a lot more than I thought I would. So we have this one crisis of people, and I think it is a crisis. It's a first world problem crisis of overcoming their frugality and the options people have and leaving life on the table and impact to society. Then you have the real retirement crisis, which is the macro one of people not having enough. And we don't even really need to go into the reasons why people won't have enough. I know from a financial services perspective, they've been trying to figure out how to serve normal folks in a effective but also profitable way. And I don't have my finger on the pulse of that, maybe not as much as you. I don't know if you do or not, but have you seen any headwind? Because I worry about this sort of bifurcation of wealthy people getting served and then people that really need help. Have you seen anything happening in the financial services industry and planning industry to address that?
Well, first, I'm so glad you mentioned that the healthy sized cohort of people who are coming into retirement, hurtling toward retirement, and may not have enough, likely won't have enough. I would say one very positive development, well, maybe there are a couple, but one is that there does seem to be a fairly healthy trend toward employers wanting to keep retired employees' assets in the plan. And I will say, if there's one sort of actor in the whole retirement services space that does have sort of a benevolent interest in helping this person, it's employers. And of course, they're not always acting out of the goodness of their hearts. They're not always the most knowledgeable folks in terms of making decisions. But generally, I think that, that's a healthy direction rather than sending everybody out in search of financial advice on their own about how to do retirement decumulation. Can we think about embedding some features in retirement plans to help people who stay in the plan get, sort of figure out how much they could reasonably take and so on down the line? So I think that that's somewhat positive in terms of outcomes, retirement outcomes for people who are maybe have tighter plans. And then I do think the automation of advice, the uptake of robo advice, of solutions that try to deliver some degree of device cheaply, I think that's a healthy development as well.
I've been thinking about this a lot in the last 12 months or so. And I've come to the conclusion is I don't know if the financial service industry is going to solve it. I think if it's going to be solved, because it's not by design an investment issue, right? That's the core of most financial planning is investments in assets. Well, if you don't have assets and you don't have much free cash flow, there's not much you can do. I'm thinking that, and I'm hoping that the emerging industry of coaches that are not advisors or affiliated with a financial firm, there's now their certifications for financial coaching. Now it's a very unregulated industry and the lines are very blurry on that, but I'm wondering if that might be a place that can help more because it's not making financial assets the hub of everything. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, certainly starting earlier, starting that sort of coaching earlier seems like it has some potential. And I love the idea of even, Secure 2.0 brings in some features that are more holistic, like this idea of embedding an emergency savings account alongside your 401k account and allowing people to contribute to that on autopilot, just as they do with those 401k contributions. I think those are some healthy steps in the right direction to help people at a younger age improve their finances. So maybe.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Well, let's move on to the state of investments and investment products when it comes to retirement. I'm a very organic person when it comes to investing, so I have my biases. But from your perspective, what have you seen there that seems to make sense to you or seems like good trends?
Well, I haven't seen like the killer retirement income, retirement cash flow product. Frankly, I think the closest to the ideal product that I've seen would be sort of the managed payout type of funds, which really fizzled in terms of ever attracting investor flows. But I think something that takes a bundle of assets and delivers sort of a paycheck equivalent in retirement is the closest thing that I can think of to an ideal retirement decumulation product. I just haven't seen it from the major financial services providers. I think they're all trying to crack that nut, but part of the problem is that people bring so many different accounts into retirement, so it's really difficult to productize. I guess I have concluded that maybe sort of a service that does that for you is a better direction, that maybe it's just too difficult to productize.
Maybe it isn't a product. I like that word, productize. Maybe it isn't a product, it is the planning because everybody is so different in how they approach things. So I think of like when I think of investing and withdrawal strategies, obviously the one that everybody talks about probably too much is the 4% rule, right? And just having something that works around whatever the latest research is on that. Even the difficulty with that seems like an outside in. Let me define your box of life, and then you have to stay within the box, right? That doesn't sound very attractive, and I don't know rhythm-wise people want to spend that way because they're so worried about the go-go years. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Well, exactly. And, the more we work on this research about retirement income and safe withdrawal rates, the more I do realize that the sort of, fixed real withdrawal system is just not the way people spend. That actually they do spend just as you suggested, Roger, where they spend more early in retirement and then that tapers off. And the 4% style guidelines just don't jibe with that sort of real life spending pattern.
Yeah, my audience is going to roll their eyes probably, but one of the things that I'm been thinking way too much about when it comes to retirement planning, Christine. And we had Rick Nason on, who is a professor who wrote a book on this a couple weeks ago, is I think we tend to approach retirement as a complicated problem, and complicated problems can be solved mathematically. You can create the algorithm and it's solved. And really what it is a complex problem, which by its nature cannot be solved. It can only be managed because of so many variables that interact. And I think things like the 4% rule and a lot of the geekier math out there, that's always very helpful and we need the math, but it's not solvable. So we need to realize that, and it probably will save us a lot of headaches. Speaking of something that's not solvable, it doesn't seem as long-term care insurance. And I know this is something that you've written a lot about, one, because of personal experience and your exploration of it. It's something that people think about a lot, and it's very difficult to find solutions. So what's your latest perspective on that?
Well, I will say from an insurance perspective, thanks to rising interest rates, things look a little better in terms of pricing of insurance and potentially these premium hikes that people who have long-term care policies have experienced, that rising interest rates do make that better for insurers. So if they're taking in these premiums and they can invest it in something safe that also has a decent return attached to it, it just makes that whole product much more just much more tenable than was the case when interest rates were so low for so long. So I think the insurance landscape is improving a little bit. I think people want to think about having a plan regardless of, you know, what's going on in the insurance market, if they've set aside the idea of purchasing insurance because they haven't liked what they've heard about claims or about premiums going up or claims being denied or whatever the case might be. It's still important to have a plan. And so I often talk to, I think about sort of our Morningstar demographic where you've got people with investment portfolios, maybe in the neighborhood of 1 or 2 million or more, and they want to set aside kind of a long-term care fund where they want to self-fund long-term care. I think that that's a viable way to go about it, but I think it's important to really right-size that fund, look at the data on the typical long-term care stay, for example, is in the neighborhood of 1.5 years or so. If you're a healthier person, you'd probably actually want to set that number a little higher because you're more likely to experience cognitive decline within a healthy body, which is a terrible combination from the standpoint of long-term care.
I didn't think about that perspective of it. That's true, isn't
It
it?
is.
Yeah.
It is. It's something that came out in a conversation that I had with Carolyn McClanahan, where she made exactly that point. And her point too was, you see these data points about long-term care usage, and she's like, someone's bringing those numbers down, and it's people who aren't that healthy. So if you're a healthy person thinking about a long-term care plan, you might want to plan for a sort of a larger long-term care fund, whereas someone who has had perhaps more health issues in the years leading up to retirement might, be a little closer to the averages or below average. We know that women are more likely to have a paid long-term care need than men because women are often the caregivers for their partners, and then the partners predecease them and no one's there to care for us. So women, especially single women, I think it's super important for them to have a long-term care plan.
Yeah, and I guess it's the same way with longevity, right? You have the average longevity, and you're going to skew. Some people are bringing it down, and some people are bringing it up demographically. It would be the same way. That makes total sense.
Exactly.
When I think about retirement planning, we think of sequence of return risk, interest rates, the economy, this year of the election, life circumstances, whether it's spending shock or family need, etc., lack of pension. It is truly overwhelming and interconnected. How does someone begin if they've been saving all their lives, they're 3 to 5 years from retirement, and they're just trying to get something in place? How do you prioritize? Because you can't fix everything or think about everything at once.
I would say get some advice, right? I mean, and maybe it's just that I encounter so many DIY types through Morningstar and through groups that I'm involved with, like Bogleheads. And I think that sometimes people underappreciate the complexity of retirement decumulation versus doing a financial plan in the accumulation years, which is, comparatively so much simpler to create a sane plan for your accumulation years. So, as much as people might have done really well as DIY type investors, this is a place where you need a sounding board on whatever plan it is that you've created for yourself. You need someone to kind of check potentially whether you've got blind spots in your plan, whether there are risk factors that you've underappreciated. So I'm a big believer, even if you're not signing on for a regular advice engagement, if you're not, paying the advisor on an ongoing basis, just get another set of eyes on your plan rather than trying to go the DIY route for your retirement. Now you may decide, well, I'm okay from here. Once I've got this check, I'm okay managing. But I think just having that set of eyes on your plan is absolutely essential.
Couple questions around that. One is I like the way that you said, even if it's not forever, right? Because I think a lot of times when people think about engaging a planner, their perception is it's the Hotel California, right? You check in
Right.
anytime you want, but you never leave. And even if it's not just one-time planning, I know like in our firm, we have clients that will actively say, you don't need us anymore. And you're through whatever you are, and it's you got this, and then they can come back when they want. So not thinking of it as a all in or all out decision helps change it a little bit, because good planners aren't cheap, a lot of them, right? There's a capacity constraint. One thing I wanted to ask you though, related to that, is I get a little worried because I think financial planning generalists, there's a difference between that than a retirement planner. I think it's like the difference between a surgeon and a general practitioner. There's so much different about decumulation, not just simply in taxes, which is one of the biggest levers, but the tax law and withdrawal, sequence of return, front loading life, et cetera, that are very specific. And I have encountered, and I have just anecdotal evidence of people in our Rock Retirement Club or people that email me of just horrible experiences with advisors that are financial planners that either they can't talk about taxes or they don't know anything about taxes. I just worry that just going to a generalist financial planner could almost be a disservice in some way. Do you have any perspective on that?
Yeah, no, I could see that. And I do love the trend toward people getting, virtual advice versus, oh, I've got to find a planner in my community or whatever, because that's inherently going to restrict you, especially if you live in a smaller place. Um, so I think it's super important for people to interview planners, prospective planners about, so what's the average age of your client base? If it's nothing like what my age is, well, then maybe you're not the right person for me. So to get quite clear on, age, asset level of that planner's typical client, I think those seem like perfectly valid and important questions to ask.
Yeah, it brings to mind. So we'll put in our 6-Shot Saturday email, we have a worksheet of interview questions, how to search for and how to interview.
I love it.
And one of them is tell me about your process in detail, because they should have a repeatable process.
I love it.
Christine, I can't wait for the moment that I get to see you
Well,
face to
same,
face.
Roger.
It's going to happen.
It's going to happen.
And then we can geek out on retirement planning all night long. So, but for now, you're down in Florida, so I'm going to let you get back to the fun and sun.
Thank you so much, Roger. It's great to see you. Thanks for having me on. It's always an honor.